I'm going to start with the belly of the fly, and I'm going to take a chunk of my EP fiber. I'm going to pull that away from the stack, thin it out, and loop it around my thread and pull it back so I have a loop. That helps me hold the material right in place. I start it right at the point of the hook. I'm going to put a few wraps in front of it to hold it in place, separate it, lay it back, put a few wraps over the material going forward over the lower shank of the hook. And you want to be sure to get it fairly tight. You can let it flare out, because when it flares when you're wrapping it, that is what's going to cover up the side of the shank of the hook. You want to be sure on your first stacks here to wrap back so you get that back piece to lay down. I turn the fly over. I take a stack of the sage, and again you want to pinch off about the same amount. So I'm going to take about that much, pull it out, do the same thing, just half it over your thread, wrap your thread right through the center of it, lay it on there, give it a few wraps, we'll spread it back out. You want to be sure, there again, let it flare a little bit so it's covering up the sides of the hook. You want to be sure that you start and stop your wraps on the top in the same location that you did on the bottom. Now I fold these back one at a time. You can definitely do it two at a time. It's just this is the way I've always done it, so I just kind of stick with it. If you've been intimidated by EP flies, a lot of people have been, because they can be complicated or intimidating looking, but they really are not. It's really a pretty basic pattern to tie, and they are extremely effective in the saltwater. And you can tie these up. We tie these up to imitate a bluegill to fish for bass. When the bluegill are up spawning, the bass absolutely come in and crush them. And the bluegill pattern that we tie as well is a lot of fun to fish. So I've wrapped back over my first stacks. I've wrapped on top of it a little bit so everything's going to lay back. I'm going to bring my thread forward just a little bit. There again, I'm going to go to the bottom again, take my stack of white, get about the same amount, try to get the same amount. It's much easier to get too much white for some reason, the color variation from the white and the sage. You can definitely end up with too much white. You really can't use not enough. You can tie these very, very sparse. The sparser you tie them, the quicker they're going to sink. You know, and normally when I throw these, I only want them to ride a foot or two in the water column. So you do want them fairly light and sparse. There again, wrapping forward on it, letting it flare. Go back to where I started. I want to be sure I get this to lay right down where I finished my last wrap, so it's seamless. So you just get it to lay right on itself there. Come to the middle of that, flip it over, take my next stack of sage. That looks pretty good. Until you get used to handling this stuff, it is a little bit difficult. It can knot up on you. Just handle it with care until you get used to it. Don't grab a chunk of it and try to rip it off there. You're going to ruin a lot of your fiber. And EP fiber is not inexpensive by any means. Out of a pack, I'd say, depending on the flies that you're tying, the size of them, you should be able to get a minimum of 20, and you could probably tie almost 50 flies out of a pack. So tying this pattern is much more economical than buying it. If you go to buy this pattern, you're going to spend anywhere from $4 to $7 on them, depending on where you are. So learning how to tie this fly is crucial. On this pattern, we are going to have bare hook sticking out of here. That's not going to matter, because when the fish hit this, you're going to fish it, taking it away from the fish, and they're really not going to care that you have this open area of the eye of the hook sticking out. So did the top, flip it over, wrap the bottom. You want to be sure you wrap this in there fairly well. And again, with this pattern, I'm only going to throw a half hitch in here because I'm going to put UV finish on the head of it, and that's going to hold everything into place. So as long as you just throw a couple half hitches in there, you're good to go, because that UV finish is really going to lock it all down. Trim my thread off, and that's essentially done for the fly. However, I need to trim it, I need to get the eyes on it, and I need to put my finishing UV finish right on the head of it there. So I'm going to start trimming this, and we'll see what happens. Alright, so I have mine trimmed up. Just a good thing to keep in mind, you can always trim it and make it shorter, but I've yet to find how to trim it and make it any longer. So be very generous when you're cutting that. You can always take more off, but you can't put it back on. So we're to the point we're going to put the eyes on. Again, I have my Zap-A-Gap gel, and what I'm going to do is just put a little glob right where I want my eye to be. Normally when I'm tying these up in a lot of numbers, when I'm down in the Gulf, I walk around with a lot of EP fiber and eyes glued to the end of my fingers, so you don't want to do that. You get your little, you can use a toothpick to push them on there, but just get that on there. Push it down for just a few seconds to be sure it's taken into the shank of the hook. And again, this is gel, so it's not going to bleed everywhere. So pushing that fly on is pushing the eye onto it. It's going to push the gel down into it and hold that eye nice and tight. Do the same thing on the other side. You do want to be sure that you're making them fairly symmetrical. So you want to be sure that the eye on the right side is similar to the eye on the left side. And again, watch your fingers, because this Zap-A-Gap is no joke. If you've messed around with it, it will definitely get you quickly. So I'm just checking to be sure they're pretty lined up. Hold it on there for a second. That looks good. Like I said, the UV finish that I'm using here, I just put a little bit of that on the end of a toothpick, and it's just a little tiny little dab, because you're not using it to build a head or anything. You're just using it to hold the thread into place. Your monocord or whatever you're using. I recommend monocord. And then you just hit it with the UV light. Like I said, this stuff cures very quickly when you hit it with the light. And that's it. And that's your Spanish anchovy.